for joining us today. My name is Marilyn Siebold. I am a longtime volunteer with NAMI Delaware. I am also on the board of NAMI Delaware, and I'm really glad to be presenting to you today some of the information I've shared with a lot of other people, families and friends, about transforming psychological trauma into peaceful resilience. So, you know, there's a lot to disagree about these days. But one thing we can probably all agree on is that we're living in a very, very stressful world. Now, good stress, you know, is good because some kind of stress helps motivate us, it inspires us, it can help us get things done. But bad stress is often what is called toxic stress. And honestly, toxic stress is something that does real injury to ourselves, to our minds and our bodies, to ourselves and our communities. You may also have heard the word trauma. And what comes to mind might be bodily injury or PTSD. But we're going to talk about trauma in a little different context today. I'm going to be talking about psychological trauma, which is the emotional, psychological, and physiological result of heightened levels of toxic stress that comes from experiences of danger and violence, significant loss and life-threatening events. And finally, you've probably heard about resilience, and what might come to your mind is bouncing back, but I'm going to be talking about resilience in a little broader way as well. So, having said that, let's begin. And as always, I would like to suggest that you keep in the back of your minds, why does it matter? Why does it matter to understand about psychological trauma? And why does it matter to understand about resilience? So I'd like to introduce some principles about the trauma-informed approach that I believe are very, very important to supporting peacemaking. You will hear about this during the webinar, but you may have heard about this in other places. So these are the guiding principles of the trauma-informed approach. We're going to honor these principles, you know, in the next hour that we're together. And I want to say that creating a physically and emotionally safe environment, establishing trust and boundaries, supporting autonomy and choice, creating collaborative relationships and participation opportunities, and using a strengths and empowered focused perspective to promote resilience are ways in which the principles of a trauma-informed approach really work to reduce re-traumatization and promote healing. So what is resilience? Well, resilience is a process, I believe. It's a process of finding healthy ways to adapt and cope and grow from adversity and distress. In the program today, we're going to look at the process of resilience, and I will talk about resilience in a broad way, but I also want to address the audience. Many of you, I'm sure, have a family member or a dear friend struggling with a serious chronic mental illness. And at NAMI, we help families and friends of people with serious mental illnesses to become more resilient. How do we do that? We embrace realistic optimism. We practice problem solving. We engage in adaptive resilience, which I define as advocacy work. Advocacy to reform healthcare, because we want to create positive change in our communities. We find and share resilient role models. We're there for others. And we believe in education. And I want to spend just a minute, a few seconds actually, talking about education, because I think education is especially important. Learning to understand something new, especially around tough topics like toxic stress, is what experts really view as a key factor to building resilience. So in this educational program, and in the many of the NAMI educational programs that we offer, we don't always have all the information you need, but our goal is to empower you to know what are the right questions to ask. And that is the really key to successful education. Now, keep calm and be resilient. I love this little poster. Well, you don't have to be the Queen of England to be resilient, although I think she is a very resilient person, and I can talk about that some other time. But this is one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons. It says, he appears to have lost all his resilience. So coping with stress in a positive way is really what resilience is all about. It's what gives people the emotional strength to cope with trauma and adversity and hardship. This afternoon, like I said, we're going to talk about these topics in a general way, but because I represent NAMI Delaware, I am going to focus a little bit more on supporting resilience as people, as family and friends living with those who have a mental illness, because it really takes a toll on family members and friends. Again, just a couple of quotations that I think are really meaningful, that are important to me, is this by Nelson Mandela. The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. I mean, to me, that epitomizes resilience. And out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars. Again, that's resilience, okay? We have all suffered. We are all suffering. But those of us who have emerged from suffering will have a great deal of resilience because we have learned. So let me say just a little bit about trauma and traumatic stress and toxic stress, and what do you know about it? What have you heard? I don't know, this picture, this is kind of me. This is how I feel right now. We're all experiencing, I think, a lot of toxic stress with the pandemic. But I'd like you to keep in mind that trauma is not just an event. It's a series of events and circumstances that causes our alarm system in our brain that there is danger. And the constant stressful messages that we get that a person is always in danger. It may be family abuse, it might be critical health conditions, might be lack of financial resources, it might be constant interruptions of daily living. Those nonstop alarms really get in our way of helping us getting back to our typical or normal coping mechanisms. I think it's important to remember that trauma really overwhelms our capacity to cope, and it undermines our ability to cope in so many different ways. Now, the DSM-5, for those of you who are familiar with the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is used to classify different mental health conditions, does talk a little bit about trauma. And they say that trauma, occurs when a person is exposed to these situations, and it may lead to trauma. I know that family members and friends really talk about living with a loved one, dear friend with mental illness is really a traumatic experience, and it has serious impacts on our mind-body connection. So let me say just a little bit about that, about how trauma can overwhelm our coping capacity. If you think right now, so let's just think for a minute about, you know, how all of us are dealing with the pandemic. And I think all of us, you know, have been impacted by it in some way. Think about trauma overwhelming our coping capacity. So again, think about your own particular stressful situation that you're encountering now. So you may find that you respond physically, you know, your body shakes. I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm really nervous, I feel like I'm really trembling. Yeah. Or sometimes when I am under a lot of stress, physically, I actually get really cold. Socially, when you're experiencing this kind of toxic stress, socially, you may find yourself unable to connect with people who care about you. And I'm thinking about a friend of mine that I talk to a lot, and she lives in New York. She actually lives in New York City and sort of the epicenter of the pandemic. And she is really finding it hard to respond to those of us who want to talk to her or who want to Zoom with her, because even though that's her usual coping mechanism, she can't really do it right now. Environmentally, you know, the toxic stress about where we live or work sometimes becomes more than we can handle. I don't have children living at home, but I know that my friends and some family members who have many young children living at home. So they're trying to, my friend is trying to manage her work. She's got 3 kids staying at home, living at home with her, trying to learn virtually, getting her school done online. That environment is full of toxic stress. Emotionally, you know, when we're under a lot of toxic stress, we express very, very strong feelings, and it's hard to sometimes manage those feelings. We may be very angry or very irritable or very upset in a lot of ways. It's really hard to manage our emotions. Well, intellectually, you know what toxic stress does to you intellectually. Have you ever, are you aware that when you're under a lot of stress, you can't remember things? You say, oh my gosh, I forgot to make that phone call, or my gosh, I forgot what he just said to me, or you know, I forgot where I was supposed to be today. You know what? That's okay. That is an expected response to trauma and toxic stress. Don't worry about it. It is to be expected. If you weren't impacted by those kind of intellectual challenges, you weren't paying attention. And I think spiritually, toxic stress can cause us, can lead us to give up hope. And of course, that is not a good thing. So I hope I gave you some examples of how trauma, otherwise known as toxic stress, can overwhelm our coping capacities. Now, there is brain science behind toxic stress. There really is. When we are under a lot of stress, the parts of our mind and body, our central nervous system, our hormonal system is sending out messages. And those messages are danger, danger, danger. So what happens when we are in danger? Well, there's a lot of good coping mechanisms we can do when we're in danger. If we know that we are in danger, we can fight back. And I don't mean necessarily fisticuffs, but you know, there's a way of responding, fighting back to the danger. Or we can run away. So in some cases, flight makes sense. Some cases, fight makes sense. Freeze is kind of an expected experience too. Sometimes you're so overwhelmed, you just freeze. You can't think straight. What have we learned about this brain mechanism and how it impacts anybody, not just people who are, say, in a war zone or in a one-time dangerous situation? I just want to introduce you really quickly, because I could talk about this a long time. It's fascinating. One of the most fascinating correlation studies, I think, that's ever been done is something called the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, that was conducted in California with the Kaiser Permanente health system. And just really quickly, the clinical people there were working with a lot of adults who were at least, let's say, highly educated, had a lot of financial resources, were probably not minorities because they could afford this very expensive healthcare. And they were really stunned about how come these adults weren't responding successfully to evidence-based practices to lose weight, to deal with addictions, smoking. What was happening? So over several years, 95 to 97, they interviewed 17,000 of these healthcare members, and they started asking questions. And they asked them questions about their childhood. Now, keep in mind, these were adults. So they asked them about their childhood experiences. What did they ask them? Well, these were samples of the 10 criteria that they were asking questions about. You know, they were asking if they self-report, if they remember having abuse in their background or neglect, or what the researchers called household dysfunction. Having a family member with a mental illness, having a family member dealing with substance abuse, having a family in which there was domestic violence. So all this stuff they asked about, and to their astonishment, many of these adults reported at least one, many of them 2, 3, or 4 examples of these childhood traumatic experiences. And what they found out then was they did some correlations, and they found that for the people who answered, who had 4 or more of those 10 ACEs, and there were a lot, they were twice as likely to smoke, 10 times more likely to partake in IV drug use, and 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. But I also want to say that they also found that they were twice as likely to have cancer or heart disease, and 4 times more likely to have emphysema. Now, over the years, these ACE surveys have been replicated all over the country. The questions have been changed a little bit, but there's still those 10 criteria, although there's some other additional ones they've added, like bullying. And this little graph here is just representative of what we seem to see with adverse childhood experiences. Again, these are adults. Nationally, almost 23% of adults in these surveys have reported 2 or more ACEs as children. In the city of Wilmington, Delaware, look at that, 27.5%. So the message from that is that we need to be very mindful that we as adults are going through a lot of toxic stress, and so are children. And the impact of toxic stress with children carries on into us as adults. So again, the lesson, why does it matter? Why should we know about trauma and toxic stress? Why should we find out more? And we need to ask a lot of more questions. Well, prolonged exposure to trauma and or repetitive trauma events, you see, it causes our alarm system to never go off, never goes off. It's always on, and it's doing huge damage to our bodies, but we know our mind-body is connected. So it creates physical, emotional, spiritual, all those other criteria I said, responses to stress. It results in emotional numbing and psychological avoidance. So again, can you think about maybe people you know or communities you know, family members who seem to be emotionally numb and are just avoiding psychological, interactions? It could well be that they have been and or are still experiencing so much toxic stress that their ability to cope is hugely diminished. I think another thing that is really important is that this exposure to toxic stress or trauma really affects our sense of safety. And I mean, if there's any takeaway from this presentation, I think it's really important for us to remember that we find it hard to learn. We find it hard to make good decisions. We find it hard to pay attention if we never feel safe. There's physical safety and there's psychological safety. And this lack of a sense of safety really diminishes all of our ability to trust others. I want to now just switch over a little bit because I want to talk a little bit about the catastrophic stress of mental health conditions as they are experienced by family members and friends. So again, I guess I want to say also, I'm talking about this, but I know that statistically, probably a lot of people listening here have a family member with a mental illness or have a friend with a mental illness. So why do we talk about this experience as being traumatic? Well, first of all, it's generally an unanticipated event when a family member or friend, gets diagnosed with a mental health condition. I can tell you from personal experience of myself and other friends and family members, it's really unanticipated. It's quite a shock to the system. You often have little time to prepare for it. It's not something that, it often happens to you. It feels like it happens very suddenly. And so you don't have this time to prepare for it. What I have found really helpful about NAMI and all the educational programs that we offer, it's not that we always have all the right answers, but we at least help you know what are the right questions to ask. And I think that if you don't know the right questions to ask, it makes sense that you don't know what you don't know, so you don't have time to prepare for it. You don't have previous experience. It's a huge emotional impact because, again, if you know anything about mental illness, there's no cure. There is no cure for mental illness. There is recovery. People do recover, and you can recover some of the things you lost from before you had the mental illness. You can recover your job or your friendships, but you are never cured. And I think that's what makes the experience of living with a mental illness, yourself or with a family or in a friend friendship, relationship in the community makes it such a huge emotional impact. And it feels like it's a threat. You feel like you're in danger all the time. I do want to talk about vicarious trauma. You may have heard about that. You may have heard about vicarious trauma, and that is the experience of not actually having the trauma happen to you. But I'd like to really talk about vicarious trauma sort of in a positive way and sort of like vicarious resilience. Because vicarious trauma is a process of change that happens when you care about other people. So you see, if you experience vicarious trauma, you shouldn't feel guilty about it. If anything, you should feel good because it is a reminder that you are a person with a huge amount of empathy. You care about other people who have been hurt, and you feel committed or responsible to help them. Now, over time, if you don't take care of yourself, if you don't turn vicarious trauma into vicarious resilience, it really then overwhelms your ability to cope. So remember that vicarious trauma happens to people like you because I know that you are an empathic person because you wouldn't be here in this webinar if you didn't care about other people and weren't a person with empathy. But just to remember, over time, this process can lead to changes in your physiological, psychological, physical, and spiritual well-being. And so you just got to make it work for you and not against you. Again, I think just a reminder about what empathy is, it's an ability to identify with another person. Is it hard sometimes to have empathy? Yeah, it is. It takes a little work to try to understand and to feel and to try to make a connection with what's going on with somebody you care about in your experience. So, some of the unhelpful things about responding to another's pain or problems to say, oh, this will go away with time, or, this too shall pass away, or, oh, you think you've got problems, listen to mine, or what. That's not empathy. So just think about the kinds of problems or people do you find it especially easy to empathize with? And what are some of the ways that caring about people might have affected you? Let me, again, just switch over just a little bit about vicarious trauma and families and friends of people with mental health conditions. And I would say that even if you don't have a family member or friend with a mental illness, think about families and friends who are going through other traumatic experiences. And you as a caring, compassionate friend might be experiencing vicarious trauma. Well, the families that I've had the pleasure and honor to be with in some of the NAMI support groups is that I know that a lot of families assume overwhelming responsibility. Now, responsibility is a good thing. We need to be responsible for one another. But sometimes that overwhelming responsibility kind of gets in your way because you think that you have to do everything, you have to save the world. And I'm guilty of that, as probably some of you are too. So it's the overwhelming responsibility that I think we need to sort of be aware of. That gets in our way of taking care of ourselves and be resilient. And families and friends, again, may find themselves trying to help their loved one in ways they're not prepared for. How many of us in high school, got a whole class or learned even in college about how to be a family member or friend of a person with a very serious chronic mental illness? Probably none of us. We're not clinicians. Unless some of us are, but a lot of us aren't, so we didn't know that. I know that a lot of family members I talk to say, oh, I feel like my home is like a treatment facility. We're all working 24-hour shifts 7 days a week. That's kind of a reflection of an overwhelming responsibility. We really do talk about the painful grief and distress when you have a loved one or dear friend who doesn't get the help they need. You know, you think about a spouse with a mental illness, or a child or a parent, again, or a dear friend, a neighbor, a coworker. I mean, I really want to say family and friends. It's very important to me to keep this larger context. And it is really painful. It is a huge loss when you know that somebody has a condition that's painful for them and there's no cure. A lot of families feel emotionally exhausted. Well, can you imagine that you feel just drained if you are trying to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, sort of creating your own treatment facility in your home? But think about a lot of family members right now during the pandemic. And again, I want to just get back to, even if there's nobody in your life with a mental health condition, families must be feeling really emotionally exhausted right now, trying to manage schoolwork and their own work and other illnesses of family and friends, plus all the news that's going on 24/7 on our news media. Are we not all emotionally exhausted at some point? Yes. I do want to say a little bit about stigma, though, because there is still a huge stigma associated with mental illness. There's a history of sort of blaming and shaming family members for causing mental illness. We know that that is so not true, but there's still that stigma that there must be something wrong with you, with that person with a mental illness, with their family members, okay? What often happens, though, is that family members sometimes start feeling resentful towards their loved ones because of the stress that their condition is putting on themselves, on them, on others. The stigma, I think, is, again, it's a personal experience sometimes, but it's also a community experience, because there really still is not enough work being done. There are not enough resources to support recovery, but we'll talk about it at the end. And a lot of times families find inadequate support. And again, when they're overwhelmed, sometimes they don't know how to reach out. They find the service system, you know, lacking in resources. Somebody said to me that mental illness is the only illness where, when you get the diagnosis, people don't come over with a casserole. It is hard to find support when you have a family member or friend, you know, without it is hard to reach out sometimes to others when you're feeling the stigmas, I guess I want to say. So now let's talk about resilience and why it matters. So again, resilience is a process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, and tragedy and stress. So in psychological studies, there does seem to be some indication that some people have personalities that seem to make them, to build up that seems to indicate a greater capacity for resilience. But studies also show that resilience can be reinforced, that we can build upon our capacity to be resilient, because resilience is about thoughts and behaviors and actions. And really, these can be learned and developed in anyone. We can support resilience in ourselves. We can support resilience in other people, in our families, and in our communities. it is really possible to help promote resilience that will allow people to recover and heal. And I would like to say it is possible to help promote resilience in communities. I really believe that will allow communities to recover and heal. In the past, you know, we talk about resilience as bouncing back, and that's sort of okay. But I like this. I think resilience is about bouncing forward. Somebody shared with me a very interesting model about what life is like right now in the pandemic. And it's a three-pronged model that once upon a time, we had organization, or we thought we had organization. We thought our lives, our world was organized. And then all of a sudden, we have the pandemic and there's disorganization. So again, if I would say about family and friends, at one point before the loved one has a diagnosis of mental illness, it's organized, predictable. Now, a diagnosis of mental illness and there's disorganization. But bouncing forward is that you go from disorganization to reorganization. Not necessarily going back to the way things were, because maybe that's even not the best way to be, but we can do better, we can bounce forward. And that's what I want to always remember about resilience. So how are family members and friends resilient? Well, here are some examples of resilience factors. And I do share this with some of the family members I talk about. So let me ask you, as you're looking at the screen, you know, which resilience factors do you have? I know that all of you have several of these, you know. Why I just want to say something about optimism, though. Optimism isn't just saying, oh, everything's going to be fine. Oh, this will all work out, because you don't know that. But being hopeful, I think, is really important to say, I'm going to go on this journey with you together, and I am hopeful that we will bounce back and reorganize in a better way. But again, look at some of these resilience factors. These are all factors that we already have that we can build upon, and we can help others build upon if we do this collaboratively. So again, here are some of the things. So I'm going to now talk about some of the family programs that we provide and how they do this. Well, first of all of our NAMI family programs, look at the top, focus on optimism or hope. We focus on people's strengths, never their weaknesses. Everybody has strengths. Sadly, we don't focus on them enough, but we do that with NAMI. Our attitude towards life is that we focus on what we can do, not on what we can't do. And there's a heck of a lot we can do if we support one another and do it collaboratively. NAMI programs focus on good communication, and this is so important. I can't go into all of it in the short time we have now, but we really have some excellent skill building materials that help all of us think more about how to hear and how to be heard, and focusing on, you know, I statements rather than you statements, and being aware of our emotions and the emotions of, and not making judgments about them, but really honoring even the unpleasant emotions we have. We need to be aware of it. It helps in communication, and that's what good communication is, hearing and being heard. We talk about how we can respond to circumstances, control ourselves, but also advocate, how we can be advocates for others to improve the lives of family members and friends. We have a wonderful social network of families and friends. There are people we can talk to at any time, and they understand and they get it. When you think about some friends that you probably have in other circumstances, are there certain people that you can, count on to just listen? What a valuable resource that is. That's what NAMI has. We do use a sense of humor, and we do laugh at life's frustrations. I used to teach a family-to-family program with a co-leader, and he used to bring in jokes every week. And I got to tell you, for those of us living through some tough times, it was really fun to have a few belly laughs once in a while. We believe in ourselves, we have confidence in ourselves, and we support, I would say we support competency. We believe that family members do have the capacity to be competent in taking care of themselves while they're taking care of others, creating a better world. And when you feel more competent, you are definitely feeling more confident in yourself. And we do a lot of work about problem solving. So just as we get to the end, I want to talk a little bit about some factors that promote resilience. And I found these in another context for something else I teach, but I really think that these are quite important, and they're easy to remember because they all begin with C, okay? Though they're connections, relationships, communications, confidence, competence and commitment, and control. So just a little bit about connections. I do want to say something about that. We talk about social distancing, and I prefer to use the term physical distancing. We need to maintain the social connections even while we engage in physical distancing. And with NAMI Delaware, we've turned all of our educational support groups over to virtual programs, and we maintain those connections. So we are maintaining the connections even with the physical distancing. Communication. Communication is all about really listening to understand, speaking to be heard, and making sure our communication really is sensitive to what's happening to others as well as to ourselves. I think that this is just, communication is so important. I think it's really important to always let the other person know that they have been heard and that they matter. I think if you think about in our society today, it feels sometimes, does it not, like we're just talking at somebody, but not talking with. So communication is as much about listening as about saying. Building self-confidence, establishing a good sense of self-concept, an understanding of our values and what's important for us and believing ourselves, that is really important in resilience. It's important to remember that even the most resilient among us are still breakable. We're emotional human beings. We break, but we can feel the emotions of hardship while knowing that we're going to survive these difficult feelings. That's why I think confidence is so important as a criteria for resilience. And competence, I really believe everybody has the capacity for resilience. We talk about knowledge, skills, and abilities. I really believe, think about the resilient people in your life. Resilient people they don't possess like mysterious or magic or unique qualities. I think instead they've retained or secured really important resources that they can share with others. some of NAMI's principles for living a balanced life include things like setting limits, letting go, and self-care. And I think that really is what competence is sort of all about. And finally, I just want to, the last thing is control. And I don't mean controlling others. I mean controlling ourselves and how we respond to our circumstances. There's, a psychological concept about locus of control, and studies show that people who have a high internal locus of control are more resilient. And what that just means is that people who really believe that they have control over some things are a lot more likely to be resilient. They focus on what they can control, and recognizing that some things are out of our control. But there's a lot of things that we can control in our lives to support our resilience. So the last slide is that I want to mention that NAMI has a great many different programs and resources that build resilience. They are for people living with mental health conditions, and they are also for family members and friends. So I do hope that you have an opportunity to go to the NAMI website, learn more about these problems. And again, I thank you very much for sharing your time. And I hope that you got something out of this workshop, and that you can feel more confident that you can also be resilient. Thank you.